There was one rule the modern world took for granted until the sky itself proved it wrong. Science makes progress, politics makes wars, but science does not end civilization. You believed that for decades. You believed that advances meant better lives, that engineers and physicians in laboratories pushed the world forward, not toward annihilation. Nations built arsenals, navies learned to sink each other, armies learned to hurt each other, but no tool at man's disposal could erase the species. That assumption had deep roots. Rutherford called nuclear energy moonshine. Einstein himself hesitated before he acknowledged the possibility. Experts wrote bracing reports and comforting limits. The public believed in breaks, diplomacy, treaties, the sheer complexity of making total destruction practical. And when a handful of brilliant scientists began whispering about splitting the atom in the 1930s, the conversation felt academic, arcane, the kind of theoretical talk that ends in page-long journal footnotes, not in sirens at dawn. But in 1945, that rule shattered in one blinding instant over the New Mexico desert. In July 1945, one test, Trinity, turned a scientific possibility into a new reality. Human beings could destroy whole cities in an afternoon, and possibly the world if we kept going. Everything changed after that realization. Robert Oppenheimer is 40 years old when the Manhattan Project brings him to Los Alamos. He never won the Nobel Prize. He won something harder, the respect and baffled affection of a generation of physicists. He is brilliant at ideas, not patient at long arithmetic. He is literate in Sanskrit, a man who quotes scripture at midnight and equations at dawn. Oppenheimer is not merely a theoretician who understands quantum mechanics. He is a builder of teams. He persuades, he organizes, he speaks the language of physics the way a conductor speaks the language of music. He can take Heisenberg-level math to a room of metallurgists and make them feel the problem as a shared human puzzle. In 1942, General Leslie Groves faces a logistical problem the world has never seen. A project so secret and so enormous it needs to invent its own infrastructure. Groves needs a scientist who can command respect, who will fuse experimentalists and engineers, chemists and mathematicians, and do it in absolute secrecy. He chooses Oppenheimer. Los Alamos is half desert, half mountain, a place Oppenheimer had loved as a young man. It becomes, under his leadership, a tiny city of genius. 764 scientists eventually, 302 at Los Alamos, part of a global effort totaling more than 600,000 people across many sites. It is a cathedral of intellect, stocked with people like Enrico Fermi, Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman, Edward Teller, and hundreds more. The context is urgent and brutal, war raging on two fronts, Nazi Germany moving through Europe, the fear that Heisenberg's team could build something first. The usual scaffold of caution collapses under existential threat. The Manhattan Project becomes not an exercise in curiosity, but a race to make the unimaginable into a weapon before the other side does. The stakes are colossal and personal. To build the bomb means mastering critical mass, neutron multiplication, getting uranium-235 or plutonium-239 into a configuration where K, the chain reaction factor, exceeds 1 and runs away in microseconds. To fail is to waste lives and urgent money. To succeed is to invent a power that changes what war and survival mean. And Oppenheimer, with all his contradictions, brilliance and counsel, charm and impatience, an early flirtation with dangerous politics, is the person the project needs to hold together the human and scientific edges of the experiment. He faces impossible choices: how to design the device, how to balance uranium and plutonium paths, how to marshal engineers and secrecy, how to prepare for moral shock that might strike the moment the mushroom cloud blooms. He also faces fear that is almost mythic. Scientists like Szilard and Teller warn of outcomes that sound like medieval bewitchment, the risk, tiny but imaginable, that a fission explosion might ignite the atmosphere. Oppenheimer and his colleagues debate probabilities that seem meaningless until you imagine the entire planet on one knife edge. The context is a wartime crucible of clocks and ethics. Oppenheimer must steer, decide, and ultimately witness. He accepts the charge. He will be the man who guides humanity to its darkest new capacity. It is July 16, 1945. The desert air is cold and thin. You can taste metal in the wind. The sky begins a slow gray that will become day. Around you, some 425 personnel stand at safe distances, binoculars, cameras, Geiger counters, and those peculiar instruments that physicists equip to watch the world change. At 5:30 a.m., the Trinity test sits in the desert like a strange sculpture. A metal tower holding the implosion device, the gadget, built of high explosive lenses and a plutonium core, a desperate solution shaped out of months of failure, false starts, and improbable inventions. The implosion design is a triumph of engineering. 32 shaped explosive lenses timed to microseconds, compressing plutonium into a supercritical sphere. Oppenheimer is there. He stands with other scientists, with General Groves, his jacket buttoned against the cold. He has recited line from the Bhagavad Gita to steady himself. The normal rituals of humanity feel absurd at the edge of this new moment. The countdown begins. 10 minutes? You feel the chill in your kidneys. You hear radios hiss. You know the historic weight of every second. 60 seconds. Technicians check fuses. A small, precise electric current runs through the firing circuits. Everything is either ready or broken. 30 seconds. Oppenheimer watches the instruments that will become the record of the first human-made supercritical reaction. Then, 5, 3, 2, 1. At 5 hours 29 minutes and 21 seconds, the desert day breaks with a brilliance the world had never seen. A blinding sphere of light sears the morning. You squint against a brightness that is like a second sun. A shockwave rolls the ground. The sound takes time, first a pressure, then a long, deep thunder, the heartbeat of the planet. The explosion yields roughly 20 to 25 kilotons of TNT, about 25,000 tons. The desert glacifies. Sand becomes green trinitite. The mushroom cloud climbs to 12 kilometers. Seismographs feel the jolt 160 kilometers away. For a moment there is silence. Then Oppenheimer remembers the Gita. The words come like both prayer and confession. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. He is not the only man changed. Men around him stand stunned, some laugh, some cry, most only stand silent, because in their mouths the language shifts. This is no longer theory. This is a weapon. This is real. But the test does more than prove physics. It proves that the idea of sudden, total devastation is practically possible. It proves that a single detonation can reduce a city to ash in an afternoon. It proves that death can be made efficient. The decisions that follow. The notebook pages fill with data. Yield, blast radius, fallout patterns, thermal pulse, and radiation profiles. But these are not academic figures any longer. They are maps of human cost. Oppenheimer returns to Los Alamos as the man who has verified the physics. The scientists scramble to complete working bombs in parallel paths. The gun-type uranium weapon, Little Boy, and the implosion plutonium weapon, Fat Man. The United States now confronts options. American civilian and military leadership debate deployment. Use the bomb to end the war with Japan and save lives that an invasion would cost. Or demonstrate the weapon's power in an unpopulated desert to force surrender without mass civilian casualties. Or withhold it as a bargaining chip in post-war geopolitics. The advisors tally predictions. Military planners estimate invasion casualties in the hundreds of thousands for both American and Japanese forces. The President, Truman, receives briefings in which men explain, some passionately, that a strategic, terrifying shock might bring Japan to terms without an appalling land invasion. Oppenheimer and others do not decide policy. They provide counsel and moral assessment. He understands the horror to come, but he also understands the logic militaries use. A tool to end a war sooner is also a tool that spares lives on one scale and kills on another. The bombs drop. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 Japan Standard Time, a B-29 named Enola Gay drops Little Boy over Hiroshima. The uranium bomb detonates at approximately 1,900 feet above the center of the city. The blast yields about 15 kilotons. Immediate death tolls exceed 70,000. Thermal flashes ignite whole neighborhoods. People vaporize, buildings disintegrate. The intense burst of neutrons and gamma rays pierce living tissue. 3 days later, on August 9, the B-29 Boxcar drops Fat Man over Nagasaki. The yield is roughly 20 kilotons. The topography of Nagasaki reduces the blast spread somewhat, but the carnage is immense. An additional 70 to 80,000 die either instantly or over months from burns and radiation. In total, estimates suggest roughly 225,000 dead by the end of 1945, with most of the victims civilians, women, children, the aged. The cities are not theaters of glorious combat, they are furnaces of annihilation. Oppenheimer receives the news with complexity, relief that the Pacific War ends, guilt that his creation did this, and a dawning horror at the future he has helped unlock. A moment where failure seems certain. There is a moment, embedded in argument and memory, where scientists themselves fear a cosmic judgment. Early on, some men calculate the minuscule chance of a chain reaction in the upper atmosphere. They run worst-case numbers. A consensus forms that the probability is effectively zero, but human anxiety is not always rational. Oppenheimer knows the risk was discussed and then set aside. The failure would have been infinite, it never occurs but the possibility haunts them. Then, as the bombs fall and cities burn, new failures appear. The long-term effects of radiation, genetic damage, and the ethical fracture in science. The test has worked, the bombs have deployed, but human society begins to show fissures. Scientists like Edward Teller push for thermonuclear designs. Teller's voice grows urgent. Oppenheimer resists, warning the world of a further leap into a weapon far more powerful than the ones they have unveiled. But politics and security concerns push the nuclear race forward. If you find this kind of forgotten history, the untold human cost, the ethical choices inside laboratories, the moments when science bends history, as fascinating as we do, we'd be honored if you'd hit that subscribe button. We believe these stories of courage, sacrifice, and genius deserve to be told. And by subscribing, you help ensure they aren't forgotten. The strategic shockwave. When Japan surrenders on August 15, 1945, the world breathes. But behind the relief, a new competition begins. 1949, the Soviet Union detonates its first atomic device. The nuclear monopoly is over. The logic of deterrence binds the superpowers. If one side can annihilate the other's cities, rational calculation demands measures to prevent that annihilation. The Cold War takes shape. This reality reconfigures strategy. The aircraft carrier and large conscripts remain fightable assets, but they are now potential targets for retaliation. Conventional victory loses its total meaning. The cost of escalation becomes incomprehensible. Military planning integrates second strike capacity, missile silos, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and doctrines of mutual assured destruction. Oppenheimer's technical achievement becomes the centerpiece of a geopolitical architecture built on terror. The scientific/ethical aftermath. Oppenheimer, once lauded as a hero, becomes conflicted. He chairs the General Advisory Committee and pushes for international control and arms limitation. He argues, "Let us not kid ourselves. We have altered the nature of war." Others, like Edward Teller, argue for stronger deterrence, more weapons, more tests, the hydrogen bomb, seeking security through escalation. Political leaders accept the new balance. The hydrogen bomb arrives in 1952, IV Mike 10.4 megatons, and soon scales to megaton yields measured in many millions of tons of TNT, dwarfing the Trinity test by orders of magnitude. The Soviet Tsar Bomba, detonated in 1961 at roughly 50 megatons, proves the potential of human-made atmospheric cataclysm. The arms race spins money, science, and politics into an engine of growing existential dread. People live under fallout shelters, schoolchildren practice duck-and-cover drills, and cities reckon with the idea that a single decision could end millions. Political blowback. Oppenheimer under fire. Oppenheimer's moral stance, his calls for international control and for restraint on the hydrogen bomb, ruffles feathers in a Cold War America that favors unequivocal strength. Suspicion about his earlier leftist associations, his friends, and his intellectual independence coalesce into political danger. In 1954, his security clearance is revoked after a public hearing, frank, humiliating, and theatrical. A panel questions his loyalty, his judgment, and his political associations. The result effectively removes Oppenheimer from positions of influence in national defense decisions. It is a cruel irony. The man who led creation is cast aside by those who fear his reluctance. He is both the architect of the weapon and its conscience, and the state rejects the conscience. Cultural ripple. The bomb reshapes culture. Literature, film, music, and art bear its mark. The 1950s and 60s produce works reflecting the existential dread, novels that imagine global ruin, films that visualize mushroom clouds, symphonies that try to put grief into sound. The bomb places the future itself on the stage of human deliberation. It also catalyzes movements. Voices calling for disarmament, scientists organizing for control, protest movements that will grow in the 1960s and beyond. The first step toward recognizing the need to manage antique science is born in the shock of Trinity in Hiroshima. Years later, the man who once felt the weight of the universe in a desert glow sits quietly in Princeton, older, quieter, and medical bills looming. He speaks about the bomb with the bluntness of someone who learned the cost. He loses official influence but gains an uneasy moral authority. He travels, he speaks, he tries to steer policy toward arms control. But what is the human story? What remains when the equations cool? The human narrative. You remember names? J. Robert Oppenheimer, born 1904, New York. physicist, multilingual, complex, haunted. Leslie Groves, the military organizer. Enrico Fermi, Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman, Edward Teller, the constellation of talent that built and debated the bomb. The hundreds of thousands who processed the ore, ran the plants at Oak Ridge, and built the infrastructure. Unrecognized labor that enabled the physics to become reality. You remember victims. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Roughly 225,000 dead by the end of 1945, mostly civilians. Thousands more suffer cancers, birth defects, and prolonged suffering for decades. You remember the last survivor anecdotes. A hibakusha who carries a scar the size of a palm. A scientist who never again speaks about the plateau without choking. A child in the 1950s who learns to hide under a desk. Oppenheimer dies on February 18, 1967, at age 62. He has throat cancer, a life shortened by cigarettes and strain. He leaves behind notebooks, a complicated public record, and a sentence that will echo. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Why tell this story in our time? Because the same pattern repeats. A new capability arrives, biotech, AI, climate engineering, and we must ask whether tools that change life's rules also change the rules of politics and survival. Oppenheimer's story is a template. Ambition, genius, fear, and regret converging where the stakes are ultimate. If another world conflict ever tests civilization, the shadow of Trinity will be a warning and a mirror. The technology exists to reshape the planet again. What matters is the governance, the humility, and the willingness to restrain ourselves. Oppenheimer showed how science can be heroic and terrible at once. He also showed that scientific leadership without moral scaffolding risks making permanent changes to what it means to be human. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Every click tells the algorithm this piece of history is worth remembering. We're dedicated to rescuing these forgotten stories from the archives. If you want to join us on this mission, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment with your city or state, and tell us if someone in your family served in World War II or worked on wartime projects. Thank you for ensuring that J. Robert Oppenheimer and the thousands who built and were affected by the first atomic weapons do not disappear into silence. They, and the lesson of Trinity, deserve to be remembered.